I'm Dr. Greg Ellis. I want to get back to Gary Taubes' book and his discussion of why we get fat. And in his chapter 8, titled Head Cases, he talks about the incalculable harm that the calories in, calories out theory has done to people, because it suggests the idea that obesity occurs as a result of overeating and sloth, or too little physical activity. And therefore the blame falls directly onto the obese person's character. They didn't have the willpower not to overeat. They didn't have the willpower to exercise. That there was ultimately some sort of defect in the metabolic chain that led them to eat. And he questions the idea of why would anyone overeat, creating obesity and all the suffering that goes along with it. So this is the way he bashes the calorie theory and argues why we get fat later on is based solely on the ingestion of carbohydrates, particularly easy digestible carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates, and that overeating and sloth have nothing to do with it. Now, body fat is stored calories. So the energy is actually being stored in the fat. Now, he's nipping around the edges of understanding this process, so I give him credit for that. Not many of us have done this or understood this. I wrote my book, Ultimate Diet Secrets, in 2002 when I laid all of this out, all the biochemistry out, as to what happens and how all the hormones influence the partitioning of fuel into storage in the fat. And he has got his handle on that. He understands that fuel is being partitioned into the fat, and that's why we're getting fat. But nonetheless, it is still excess calories. And because we aren't getting the calories we need, the active tissues, the muscles, the brain, the liver, don't get the calories that they need because fuel is being shoved into the fat tissue as a result of eating a high carbohydrate diet. But it's still, nonetheless, excess calories. Now, we have to eat again because we do get hungry, and we need to provide fuel for the active tissues. Not that the fuel is getting stored away in the fat cell. Now, you only can store so much fat. Obviously, there's people who weigh 600 pounds, but not many. This is under regulatory control. There's no question about that. And he writes about the way fat tissue is regulated, and it is. And he talks about the hormone lipoprotein lipase and the enzyme lipoprotein lipase and the hormone estrogen. Now, I know a bit about this because I did my doctoral dissertation on lipoprotein lipase, and I know exactly how it behaves both in fat tissue and in muscle tissue, and how it sequesters fat fuel from the blood and directs it into the tissue depending on its concentration. When you're eating high carbohydrate diet, there's going to be a lot of LPL in the adipose tissue and very little in the muscle. And conversely, if you're eating a low carbohydrate diet and or exercising, you're going to get more LPL in your muscle and direct more fat into the muscle cell where it's stored as an intramuscular triglyceride or burned as a source of fuel. But we come back now to the issue of why we get fat, why we get obese. And the incalculable harm is on the idea that we blame obese people for their lack of willpower because they overeat. Now, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think we should be blaming them. I think we should be certainly explaining to them how this whole thing works. And I do think the attack by Taubes on some of our medical establishment groups, American Heart Association and many nutritionists and doctors, he's right on the money there. They have not stayed up with what's going on, but they end up then blaming the fat person because they could not do what they were supposed to do. And look, if you're hungry all the time, as you will be on a high-carb diet, willpower will never overcome biology. So you can't do it. You can't get there from here. So he is right about that. Now, on the other hand, what happens to the low-carb dieter, the low-carb eater? Well, we have plenty of low-carb dieters that are obese. Now, you could say they aren't following the low-carb diet correctly, they don't stick with it, but there's a lot of people who do stick with it, and they are heavy, they are obese. And this has been brought to the attention of many people. Why are so many low-carbers overweight? Well, is it they lack willpower? So what happens when they quit the low-carb diet? Do they lack willpower, or does the blame fall on them? So there has to be a consideration of this. Gary Taubes would have us believe that if we just restrict our carbohydrates, we're going to become more physically active and we're going to become lean automatically. And I can tell you from experience that that is not true. That is not what will happen. It's not an automatic process. We have to add it back with and hook it up with calories in, calories out. That's the only way to work. And you want to understand this and not buy into his assertions that calories in, calories out was the worst thing that's ever happened to the obesity epidemic, to create the obesity epidemic. It's simply not true. So this is some of the mistakes he makes. I don't think he's really doing good science when he talks about this stuff, and I think he's drawing conclusions that are not supported by the science. And this is a problem, because you are going to be misinformed, you're going to be led down the wrong path, and you won't get the results you want. And you very likely may remain obese. He also talks about the emaciated marathoners, that they are driven to exercise by something that is within them. And I don't agree with that. A marathoner wants to run a marathon because he wants to run a marathon, and he will train for that. And they don't have any body fat, and they are lean, and they're all living in 65-70% carbohydrate diets. So if it were carbohydrates were the sole thing that made us fat, and if exercise didn't have anything at all to do with keeping us lean, then you wouldn't see this. The marathoner would just get fatter and fatter and fatter as he's consuming his high-carb diet, and the exercise would do him no good if exercise doesn't work. And we see the same thing in the military. These soldiers are eating largely high-carbohydrate diets, in the neighborhood of 65-70% of the calories is carbohydrate, and they're exercising all day. Well, his theory just breaks down. These are perfect examples to show that his theory is just not tenable. It's not workable. And I don't know why he hasn't made these observations himself, but he clearly has not. So that's an analysis of the third part. We have more to talk about the carbohydrates and how they affect other parts of the weight loss and weight gain equation. I'm Dr. Greg Ellis.